This is a very, very important video, and I want you to share it with everybody you know. And I want to start off with this right here. And I want there to be no misunderstanding of where I land on this. There's supposed to be this supreme law of the land called the Constitution. Embedded within the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. Inside of the Bill of Rights, there's this indelible law of the land that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the people to keep and bear arms, the unalienable right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The bedrock, the foundation of this entire government, this entire country is laid on the foundation of shall not be infringed. And it's unalienable because no government gave you this right and no government can legitimately take this right away. So what are we talking about in this video right here? First of all, I want to direct your attention to a ruling from the 1803 case Marbury versus Madison that said a law repugnant to the Constitution, in other words, a law repugnant to shall not be infringed, is null and void. It can be completely ignored, disobeyed. Nobody needs to pay any attention to it. And that includes laws that seek to protect the Second Amendment. Why would you need a law as a fence or a gate to keep people from disobeying the Second Amendment and infringing on people's right to keep and bear arms? You wouldn't. Why even have the supreme law of the land anyway when you're going to have a law that's going to go over it and try to put an umbrella over it and protect it? You wouldn't. It's an unnecessary redundancy. So what are we talking about today? I've got nothing against the gun owners of America, except that maybe they're feeding into the lie and the delusion that the Second Amendment isn't good enough and that we need laws in addition to the Second Amendment to secure people's rights. I am not for what the Department of Veterans Affairs is doing here. I'm also not for Congress, which is the opposite of progress, even though what it looks like they're trying to do is right, because there's a supreme law of the land that says shall not be infringed. And if anybody infringes on that law, then they are traitors to the country. They are infringing on the rights and the lives of Americans, whether they're vets or not. So what's happening here is the gun owners of America wrote this bill called the Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act of 2024. And what that means is the reason they wrote it and the reason it was created was to address concerns about veterans who are losing their Second Amendment rights, which they shouldn't and can't legitimately, due to mental health evaluations. And in some cases, these veterans who had been assigned fiduciaries, which is like a trustee to manage their benefits, were automatically deemed mentally incompetent by the VA. And then the veterans' names would go into the NICS instant background check system, which in and of itself is unconstitutional and anti-Second Amendment. And by the way, was set up by the National Rifle Association. Look it up. Wayne LaPierre and the National Rifle Association take credit for the passing of the bill and the law that created the NICS instant infringement check system. So the VA, if one of their veterans has a fiduciary, which is a trustee of the veterans' benefits, he automatically goes into the NICS instant background check system because he is declared mentally incompetent. And this legislation aims to restore those rights unless a judicial authority specifically rules that the veteran poses no danger to themselves or others. So that's why the Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act of 2024 was written. So that brings us to the gun owners of America, which oversaw the passing of this bill, and they're trying to make it a law. And so what they're saying is, okay, so if we pass this law, then you over there at the Veterans Affairs Office, you need to obey the law that Congress has passed, even though they're already not obeying the supreme law of the land, which is the Second Amendment. And that brings us to this clip right here that just happened yesterday.
VA's testimony stated that if the Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act is signed into law, and this is even more troubling, the VA could not comply because the VA states the Department of Justice, an executive branch agency, affirmed VA's interpretation of the Brady Act. So, is it the VA's position that the VA will not comply with an act of Congress based on another agency's interpretation of the law?
So the VA has always works to comply with all laws. We complied with the Brady Handgun Act when it was in effect. The law.
So again, is the VA's position?
The VA should not have complied with, according to the Second Amendment, according to the supreme law of the land, according to Marbury versus Madison, where any law that violates the Constitution is repugnant and is declared null and void. They shouldn't have. But now Congress is going, you mean to tell me if we make a law that you're already violating the Second Amendment over, but if we make a law, you're going to ignore us? You're going to disobey us? Why would it surprise anybody that a federal bureaucratic entity like the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs or any entity, the Department of Justice, whoever, why would it surprise Congress that they're going to disobey their commands when they're already disobeying the supreme law of the land? It doesn't make any sense. And why wouldn't Congress already have been incensed and rejected any bureaucratic agency's rejection of the Second Amendment? Why haven't they already done that? Why haven't they already gone to bat for these veterans and saying, whoa, if you're going to be the head of a federal agency and you're going to infringe when it says shall not be infringed, we, in the spirit of the supreme law of the land, reject you, you're fired, and you're going to jail. But what's their remedy? Well, we're going to make another law because the first law, the Second Amendment, wasn't good enough. And it gets worse, guys. It gets worse. This is basically like a catch-22 where it sounds like what the gun owners of America is doing is good. It sounds like what Congress is doing is good. And it sounds like what the VA is doing is absolutely bad. And don't get me wrong, what the VA is doing is absolutely bad. But the springboard and the foundation of this entire country is supposed to be the supreme law of the land, not laws Congress makes up that you have to obey now. This is where the catch-22 comes in.
Based on the statement, they could not comply with the Restoration Act, the Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act. Is it your position that you will not comply with an act of law passed by Congress?
Yes, sir. I guess based off of what you have in testimony, yes, sir.
That you would not comply?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm glad everybody hears that on the record that the VA is going to refuse to comply with, regardless of what we actually pass here, including questions that Representative Self was just asking in view of the Chevron Act being passed.
Now, what he's referring to is the Chevron deference, which is this legal principle that comes from this 1984 Supreme Court case called Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense. And it says that the court should defer to a federal agency's interpretation of ambiguous law that the agency is responsible for enforcing as long as the interpretation is what they call reasonable. So that was overturned last week or last month by the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court, and this is the catch-22 of Marbury versus Madison, because the Supreme Court is basically saying, okay, the federal agency under the Chevron deference can't have the interpretive power, so we're going to put that back in the hands of the courts. See, that's what happened with Marbury versus Madison. While there are some good things that are in that Supreme Court ruling, in other words, a law repugnant to the Constitution is void and should be if the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. Another thing that Marbury versus Madison did is it established the power of judicial review. In other words, the Supreme Court, carte blanche, gave itself the ability to interpret the Constitution. They basically did for themselves judicially what the Pope did for himself religiously back in the, whatever it was, 323, and he set himself up as the vicar of Christ. In other words, if you want to know what God's saying to the little people, you got to come to me for the interpretation. That's exactly what the black robe tyrants of the Supreme Court did under Chief Justice Marshall in 1803. They granted themselves the power of judicial review. So while a lot of people applauded the fact that this Chevron deference was overturned, it just restored additional powers to the tyrants of the Supreme Court and took that power, supposedly, out of the hands of the executive and legislative branch. In this case, it's the executive branch that they took the power out of the hands of. But this guy with the VA is basically saying, no, we've still got that power. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. Which everybody's wrong all the way around on this. All you got to do is stick with the Second Amendment. 27 words, easy peasy. Shall not be infringed. Oh, the VA infringed on it? Oh, the National Rifle Association infringed on it with the NICS instant infringement check system? Oh, Congress is infringing on it all the time? Well, then they are null and void. And that's why I'm calling this thing right here a catch-22. Let's go ahead and get back to the action on this.
Passed. Mr. Chair, I have just a couple more questions, but I think that Mr. Friel has incriminated himself and the VA that they're going to have complete disregard for what we're going to do anyway. So
Mr. Friel, you're very well aware of how you just answered the congressman's question, correct?
Sir, as I said, it's in our testimony that we would have trouble complying with that law. As I said,
Mr. Friel, you're very well aware of how you answered the congressman's question.
yes, sir.
See, Congress is not incensed that the VA is disobeying the supreme law of the land. Congress, the members of Congress, are upset that you're not going to obey us. How many times has Congress violated the Second Amendment in the name of keeping people safe? They should have struck down the NICS instant background infringement check system. They should have never started it. But now here they are. They find themselves, because they believe, while they speak with their lips, oh, the supreme law of the land is the Second Amendment. They show by their actions that they believe that the Second Amendment ain't good enough. We got to have this law right here so that we can restore the rights of veterans. And if you think that's hyperbole, and I got a lot of love for this guy. I don't have anything against Langley Outdoor Academy, but listen to how he words this, which I strongly disagree with his mentality on this. Listen to this.
So what we are looking at right here is from the GOA feed, okay? This is actual live testimony from Congress within an hour ago, okay? I'm going to get into this in a second, but as you guys are filtering in, let me explain to you what they're talking about. They're talking about a bill that is going to give veterans the rights to get their gun rights back if they're judged mentally incompetent because they can't.
A bill that's going to give veterans their rights back. If there's such a thing as unalienable rights, then there can be no such thing as a bill that can be turned into a law that gives a man his rights back. Government doesn't give or grant rights or get rights back for an individual. They can't. Saying that you can is illegitimate. So people literally believe that Congress is going to give certain men, in this case, veterans, their rights back. All we have to do to empower ourselves is to stop believing this nonsense coming out of Congress, coming out of the VA, believing that rights can be granted by these people who call themselves authorities, and just stand on shall not be infringed. You know, more than shall not be infringed, more than the right to keep and bear arms, nobody's got a right to keep you from keeping and bearing arms. And it's without qualification, the Second Amendment. It doesn't say what arms you can have and what arms you can't have or how you should or shouldn't bear them. It doesn't say it all. It just says the right to keep and bear arms, any arms you want, any way you want to, shall not be infringed. And nobody gave you that right. That's why it's called unalienable. So these Congress members who are doing what looks like a good thing, gun owners of America who look like they're doing a good thing, are actually performing a great disservice to the supreme law of the land, which is the Second Amendment. And I don't understand how people don't understand this. What they should be saying is, number one, Brady Act should have never come into being. Assault weapons bans should have never come into being. We should have resisted that from the get-go with 4 easy words: shall not be infringed. Nixed instant background check system, Brady Act, assault weapons ban, gun safety legislation. You want to save the children, don't you? Shall not be infringed. Very simple. And if anybody dares cross the line of the supreme law of the land of shall not be infringed, they shall go to jail. And I just want to end with what this letter here that was sent to the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. Look what it says. They're so shocked about this. The witness testified under oath that the department will not comply with the proposed Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act of 2024 if were enacted. Simply put, this is unacceptable. As co-equal branches of government, we trust you agree that the provisions of the bills Congress passes and the president signs into law are not merely suggestions, they are mandatory. Let me ask you, are you willing to stick by that if Congress passes and the president signs into laws something that forces you to do something against your will when you haven't violated somebody else? Are you going to throw your hands up in the air and go, well, Congress passed it, the president signed it, it's mandatory, what can I possibly do? Are you going to forego your rights? I want to go to the last page right here. It says, we insist by no later than July 18th, 2024, you submit to us your assurance that if Congress passes the Veterans Second Amendment Restoration Act of 2024, VA will comply with that act of Congress. Well, they didn't comply with the Second Amendment, which is the supreme law of the land. Why doesn't that bother you? And why would it shock you if they disobey your word when they've already disobeyed the supreme law of the land? And what's going to happen anyway when the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs disobeys the command of Congress? What's the penalty going to be? Leave your thoughts about this for the world and the thought police in the comments section below. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to this channel. If you disagree with anything that I'm saying here, let me know in the comments section. I firmly believe in the words, in the spirit and the letter of the law of shall not be infringed, shall not be violated. Anything that goes against that is null and void. If I've said anything here that was off base or contradictory to individual freedoms, let me know in the comments section below. Subscribe, like, share this video. I'll see you in the next one.